So I've been asked to speak about my Rebbe, Rav Aharon Lichtenstein, whose 10th Yahrzeit is being marked in Israel today. Anniversary of his death. He passed away 10 years ago exactly. Of course, we're right now in the process. I'm speaking in Israel, and we're in the process of transitioning from daytime to nighttime. And on that note, I would like to not apologize in advance, but notify you in advance that in the middle of this lecture, in a half an hour, we are going to pause as sirens will sound throughout Israel, marking Yom HaZikaron, Israel's Memorial Day for fallen soldiers and victims of terror attacks. So, a little bit about Rav Lichtenstein. I feel myself, and I think that every student of his would feel themselves entirely inadequate to the task of trying to introduce him or summarize him in a relatively short lecture. I have written a couple of articles in the past, some more summary, some about specific things, and I'm in the process of, I'm working on an article right now that's a little bit more actually in the weeds, but what I thought we would do is I want to introduce him as a bridging figure. And what I mean by that is that in some interesting and important ways, he straddled certain key dividing lines, lines that I wouldn't say that they divide the Jewish people, but they certainly differentiate the Jewish people. And something that I just did, and the difference between dividing and differentiating, that's the sort of thinking that I would have to say that I absorbed that from studying with Rav Lichtenstein. He was so attentive to details like that. He was so attentive to nuances of language, right? That things that divide people are things that really put people, separate them, make them on opposite sides of a gulf. Whereas things that differentiate people are things that make one group, or one set of individuals different from another set of individuals, but not necessarily not necessarily separated. They might have a very strong consciousness of being part of the same group, although there is an awareness that they're different, that they're differentiated from one another. That is, so I'm going to talk about several lines that several gulfs, several distances that he straddled. The first, and through that, well, I'm going to try to characterize a little bit who he was and why he was such an important figure and such a formative figure for so many. One bridge that he, one gulf that he bridged, one difference that he bridged was the difference between North American Jewry and Israeli Jewry. And I would even say North American Orthodoxy and Israeli Orthodoxy. When he made Aliyah in the early 1970s, he and his family moved to Israel in the early 1970s. He was just about 40 years old. Okay, he was born in 1933 in France. His family, when he was a young child, Clarksburg, Mississippi, of all places, home of the Delta Blues. Don't think that had much of an effect on his later career. and he grew up in American institutions. He studied in Yeshiva University. He studied in Chaim Berlin. His three main teachers, his three main Rabbeim that he says were the most influential on his life were Rabbi Aharon Soloveitchik, Rabbi Yitzchak Hutner, who was the Rosh Yeshiva of Chaim Berlin, and the third was Rabbi Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, who he eventually became his son-in-law. He eventually married Tova Soloveitchik, now Dr. Tova Lichtenstein, who may she live and be well. So after getting smicha from Yeshiva University, he went on to Harvard for graduate school, and he obtained a PhD in English literature at Harvard. And we'll have a little bit of show and tell here. This is the published version of his dissertation called Henry Moore, The Rational Theology of a Cambridge Platonist. Right? It's about a relatively obscure theologian from the 1600s named Henry Moore, and the circle that he was a part of in Cambridge. I'm going to return to Henry Moore in a little while, because I think that he actually does play an important role in Rav Lichtenstein's thought. So when he, after getting his PhD, he moved back to New York. In New York, he was teaching at Stern College. He was giving shiurim. He was giving Torah classes at Yeshiva University. He was on the Rosh Yeshiva track. He was going to be a Rosh Yeshiva. He was known as an up-and-coming major voice in American centrist orthodoxy, who was just starting to hit his stride. And then in the early 1970s, to the surprise of many, not least of which was his father-in-law, Rabbi Soloveitchik, he and his family, they made Aliyah to Eretz Yisrael, to Israel, and where he became the co-Rosh Yeshiva at Yeshivat Har Etzion, also known as the Gush in Alon Shvut, together with Rabbi Yehuda Amital, who invited him to be the co-Rosh Yeshiva there. Now, and this brings me to the first bridge. When Rav Aharon Lichtenstein came to Israel, the Datil Umi community, the religious Zionist community in Israel, and especially what's called the Hesder Yeshivas. A Hesder Yeshiva is a religious Zionist institution that combines Torah study with military service. I have two sons. One was in a Hesder Yeshiva, actually in Yeshivat Har Etzion, and another son is presently in Yeshiva, also a Hesder Yeshiva. And this is from within the religious Zionist communities, the ones who go to study in Yeshiva will more often than not go to a Hesder Yeshiva. Hesder literally means it's an arrangement, right? There's an arrangement by which you spend time in Yeshiva, you spend time in serving in the army. That's the nature of the yeshiva where he was Rosh Yeshiva. Now, the dominant, let's say there were two yeshiva worlds when he arrived in Israel. The old yeshiva world was what we would call today Haredi, right? Black hat yeshivas, if you will. That's what dominated the yeshiva world since, starting in Lithuania, right? And the yeshiva, the modern yeshiva, is by and large it's a Lithuanian invention, right? So that entire tradition of the yeshiva, when it was transplanted in Israel, right? It was rooted in Europe, and it was transplanted after the war in both Israel and in the United States primarily, and it was governed by the people that had been governing it, the same families that had been governing it in Europe, and they tended to be Haredi to one degree or another. So that was the traditional right? The traditional, there's, yeshiva is a place to learn Gemara and only Gemara or almost only Gemara. And that's and that's the most important thing that you can be doing with your life. Starting in the 1960s and really starting to, was really the 6-Day War that started a new consciousness within the religious Zionist community. And by the way, even until today, a certain large percentage of the people of teachers in religious Zionist institutions had come from the Haredi world, had come from the world of the traditional yeshiva. Starting in the 1960s, started earlier, but really coming of age in the 1960s, there was a young group of students who were disciples of Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook, who was the son of Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook, Avraham Yitzchak, a Kohen Kook. They were, they created a new yeshiva world, and in it, the ideas of Rav Kook, father and son, were very central. And these ideas were very heavily influenced by viewing the state of Israel through a messianic lens, through a redemptive messianic lens. That was a strong part of their yeshiva message. And everything that had to do with the state of Israel was seen as part of a redemptive process, and in which case some of the hallmarks included there was really not much attention paid to anyone outside Israel or outside the Jewish people. The bookshelf was fairly limited. There was no desire. It was not seen as necessary to have any sort of intellectual breadth. And this was the situation when Rav Lichtenstein came. What he did and what he has done, his legacy, to the extent that there is an alternative to those two models, it is largely due to Rav Lichtenstein. One of the things, he came, right, and this is something that he brought with him from Harvard. He was part of a humanistic tradition, a religious Jewish humanistic tradition, one that saw Jewishness not as something that divided the Jewish people from the rest of the world, but that maybe gave the Jewish people more responsibility, gave the Jewish people more opportunity than the rest of the world, more opportunity to become to teach the world, more opportunity. We have 613 commandments, 613 ways to express our ethical selves, our moral selves, our religious selves, whereas the rest of the nations of the world have 7 mitzvot, 7 Noahide laws. Ironically, there is a book out there called The 7 Noahide Laws by someone named Aaron Lichtenstein, who's a first cousin of Rav Aaron Lichtenstein. It's not by Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, it's confused a number of people, but Rav Lichtenstein did, that was the tradition that he came from, that the relationship between the Jewish people and the rest of the world wasn't one of separation as much as it was one of a separation of roles. It wasn't a horizontal separation. It was a vertical separation, or it wasn't an exclusion. It was a hierarchy. Different ways of expressing the same idea. Not that he thought that Jewish people were inherently superior to anyone else, and that itself is part of his humanistic belief. And he writes about this in other places, that he he writes that he did not, there is a strain within the Jewish tradition that tries to essentialize the differences between Jews and non-Jews. That strain begins really with Rabbi Yehuda Halevi in the Sefer HaKuzari, and this is in Spain in the 12th century. Some of its main proponents were Maharal in the 16th century, Rabbi Judah Loew of Prague in the 16th century, the Baal HaTanya, Rabbi Shner Zalman of Liadi, the first Lubavitcher Rebbe in the 18th century and the early 19th century, and Rav Kook. Rav Kook was part of that strain of thought, and of course that strain of thought got a large boost with the increased popularity of Kabbalah in Spain, starting in the 13th and 14th centuries. Right, so this was a very strong, perhaps even dominant strain. It was certainly the dominant strain in Israeli Dati Leumi, religious Zionist yeshivot, when Rav Lichtenstein arrived, again influenced by Rav Kook. And part of what he did, this remains the case until today, that the Merkaz Harav, right, the Rav Kook inflected institutions remain the primary, the bulk of the religious Zionist yeshivot. But to the extent that there's an alternative, right, and there are several yeshivot that are, let's say, Yeshivat Har Etzion satellites or other yeshivot where students of Rav Lichtenstein and his partner Rav Amital became Rosh Yeshiva, became the heads of the yeshiva. To the extent that there's any alternative, it starts with Rav Lichtenstein. That the non-essentialist, humanistic view of Judaism, to the extent that it has any traction, that it had any traction in Israel, it begins with him. Today, there are probably more, I think that the influence of Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, Alav HaShalom, has become a significant factor in the growth of, let's say, in the visibility of the humanistic religious tradition in Israel today. It still is far from being dominant, but it has voices, and the voices are not negligible. So that was the first bridging. Now, one of the aspects of Merkaz Harav, the Merkaz Harav ideology, that I want to turn back to is how they thought of military service. We've been talking about Yeshivat Har Etzion being a Hesder yeshiva. So within the Hesder yeshivot, there was something of a division from the outset, from the beginning of the program, right? Where you have yeshiva students that spend some of their time in yeshiva, some of their time in fighting in the army. So there were two basic approaches. We can call them, they've been called the Lichatchila approach and the B'diavad approach. Lichatchila and B'diavad are two, Lichatchila and B'diavad are two terms that are used throughout the literature of halacha. One means this is what we do in an ideal case, right? Ab initio in Latin. I don't know if that helps anyone to hear it in Latin instead of Hebrew, but that's what it means that's what's used in Latin. And b'diavad means ex post facto. If it's already done, if it already happened, right? So for example, if, a drop of milk spills into the cholent, is it kosher? Is it not kosher? Right? So lichatchila, ab initio, you are not allowed to pour even a tiny little bit of milk into the cholent. But b'diavad, if it happened because it fell in there because, I don't know, one of the kids was out of control on Shabbat morning, whatever reason, a little bit of milk fell into a tiny little bit of milk fell into the cholent. B'diavad, it's acceptable. You can eat the cholent, right? That's the category of lichatchila and b'diavad. So now let's apply that to yeshivot hesder, right? So the lechatchila approach says we should be fighting in the army. This is a privilege. This is a wonderful thing for thousands of years, for centuries. And this is really, it's appropriate as we begin Yom HaZikaron. This is a privilege. The fact that we can live in Eretz Yisrael, in Medinat Yisrael, in a Jewish state, a sovereign Jewish state with a mostly Jewish army. This is something that our ancestors dreamed about. This is something that is a rare privilege, right? We should love going to the army. We should want to go to the army. There are even certain, the more extreme formulations, and it's not extreme in the sense of meaning the mainstream figures in that community uttered them. So, for example, Reb Tzvi Yehuda Kook is reported to have said that the uniform of an IDF soldier is akin to the bigdei kehuna, the special vestments that the high priest would wear in the, or not the high priest, that the regular priest, that priests would wear when they ministered in the temple, right? That's how he saw the IDF uniform, right? That's a pretty bold statement. The other approach, and this approach was most forced. I don't know if it was forcefully articulated, but its representative was Rabbi Chaim Yaakov Goldvecht. Rabbi Chaim Yaakov Goldvecht was the founding Rosh Yeshiva of a yeshiva called Kerem B'Yavneh, which, along with Yeshivat Har Etzion, is my alma mater. In Yeshivat Kerem B'Yavneh, which claims, right, there obviously nothing is cut and dry. It claims to be the first Hesder yeshiva, and it probably is the first yeshiva that was founded solely as a Hesder yeshiva. And this is going back probably about 60 years. When it was founded, Rav Goldvecht, who was a student of Rav Avraham Yeshaya Karelitz, the Chazon Ish, and of Rabbi Yitzchak Zev Soloveitchik, known as the Brisker Rav, two of the leading Haredi authorities, Gedolim, right? So the leading leaders of the Haredi community in Eretz Yisrael, they both they both felt that a student, if you can, you should be sitting and learning. You shouldn't be going to the army. But if somebody is not, able to really burn the midnight oil, knows that they're not gonna be so successful if they study in yeshiva, then b'diavad, post facto, if the drop of milk already fell into the cholent, Hesder is not a bad plan B. And they should go to the Hesder yeshiva. And in Kerem B'Yavneh, it was known that there were, and to this day, there are still vestiges of this. A few people from the Haredi community that would go there, or people from Haredi families that would go there. And there were occasions in which Rabbi Goldvecht would encourage students who really were excelling in their yeshiva studies. He would pull them aside and say, listen, maybe you shouldn't go to the army. Maybe you should go on, switch to a different yeshiva, or stay here and not go to Hesder. So those were the two worlds. Those were the two approaches. And now in comes Rav Lichtenstein, and he says, I would say he articulates a position that on the surface shares a lot of the same assumptions as the Haredi approach. The approach that really there is nothing more important than you can be doing with your life than studying Torah in yeshiva, studying Torah all day and as much of the night as you can. That's the goal. That's the ideal. That's what everybody should be doing. If only we'd all be able to do that. That would be wonderful. And that's what we should be encouraging people to do. We should be encouraging people to excel in their Torah studies. But we live in a country where we, the Jewish people, form a majority, and it falls upon the collective Jewish citizenry, the Jewish body politic in Israel, to defend itself. And it would be a tremendous desecration of God's name. It would be terrible if people like us, people who really value Torah studying, were using Torah study as a cudgel, as a tool to get out of army service. So he makes it very clear. I think that the consequences of studying, of the consequences of serving in the army can be spiritually devastating. Whether you're talking about a combat soldier who, because of the situation, has to take someone's life. And I can tell you, I've spoken to kids who, in the past year and a half, have had to take other people's lives. And we're completely justified, and we're doing the absolute right thing by taking the lives of another, but it's traumatizing. It's a traumatizing thing. It's spiritually traumatizing. It's psychologically traumatizing. It's a very difficult thing to do. And then there's also the fact that you're in a situation where it's not the most spiritually conducive. I know from my son who's in the army right now, you don't always have a lot of time for Torah study. You don't always have a lot of time to, for davening. You can't spend time on spiritual pursuits, not nearly enough time on spiritual pursuits as you would want. Okay. And Rav Lichtenstein says, Afal piche, nevertheless, it would be unconscionable, morally unconscionable, for us to step away from service and place that burden on others. Right? This was articulated in an article called The Ideology of Hesder that was first published in English. Later, it was published in Hebrew under the title Zot Torat HaHesder. And this is, I don't know, what do you call it? Lechatchila or B'diavad? Has the drop already fallen into, on one hand, it's B'diavad because we're not excited about going to the army. We're not rah-rah about it. We're not trying to say, yay. You would never hear Rav Lichtenstein say that the IDF uniform is anything like the priestly vestments, the holy priestly vestments that were worn in the temple. On the other hand, it's lechatchila because he's saying everybody has to do it. You have to go in. His own sons, who are Rosh Yeshiva today, at least 3 out of his 4 sons, I believe, served in combat units in the IDF, in Tzahal, right? Because there's no getting out of it. It's a responsibility. It's a moral and ethical responsibility. He knew full well that communally and individually we would pay a huge price for it. And the yeshiva itself, and this I'll point out in the minute that we have left before the siren actually goes off. The yeshiva has lost 6 of its students since the beginning. His yeshiva, Yeshivat Har Etzion, has lost 6 of its students since the beginning of the present war. One of them I happen to know personally, Zachariah Haber, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, an exceptional young man, and who I will be thinking about as the siren goes off, or whose parents are dear friends, and who he grew up not far from us. When he was, I guess, a teenager when we moved to Modi'in, and others whose parents I know, and going back, since the founding of the yeshiva, probably something 15 to 20 of its students have been killed in Israel's various wars, and that's also a huge part of the price that Rav Lichtenstein knows is being paid by this community of people who there's nothing they would want more than to just sit in yeshiva for their entire lives. They don't valorize going to the army. They go because this is what our people needs. This is what our nation needs. This is what duty demands. And it's anything otherwise is unconscionable. And we go in with our eyes open, knowing that it is going to exact a terrible price on many different levels. We will pick up with another aspect of Rav Lichtenstein as a bridge after the siren. Okay, we're back. I hope that this gave viewers and listeners in Chutz La'aretz a little bit of a sense of the solemnity of the day as it is here in Israel. It's a difficult day, and it's a day that, until very recently, it was much more abstract for me. Now that I have friends and my kids have friends who have lost their lives in Israel's war, it it is completely, it's changed the experience so much. Okay, back to Rav Lichtenstein. Another bridge that he divided was the bridge between the yeshiva and the academy. Right? We mentioned that he, in addition to being a Rosh Yeshiva, he also had a PhD in English literature. Now, people hear that and they're like, oh, he's this and he's also that. I think that's not the way that I like to think about this. First of all, he was very selective in what he incorporated from the academy. When we talk about the academy that had an effect on him, we're talking about literature, we're talking about poetry. He's not necessarily talking about science. He's not talking about science at all, which he saw as something morally. He saw science as something morally neutral. He saw science as something technical, not necessarily vocational, but not humanistic. And he had an actual aversion to academic Jewish studies. There's an article that was written in Hebrew by Professor Rami Reiner from the Ben Gurion University of the Negev about Rav Lichtenstein and his attitude toward academic Jewish studies. I had the privilege of translating it a number of years ago, and we published it on the Lair House, a blog that I have written for a number of times and that I co-founded. Rav Lichtenstein was very clear that he saw Torah study has to be done with a sense of Yirat Shamayim, with fear of God. It has to be done in an environment that's conducive to a religiously conducive environment, an environment that's rooted in tradition and rooted in the fear of God. And that takes me to the academy. And I'm going to go back to Henry Moore now, right? The rational theology of a Cambridge Platonist. His dissertation, Lichtenstein's dissertation, was about a man who was very much part of the Cambridge scene in the 1600s. Well, what was the Cambridge scene in the 1600s? What was Cambridge in the 1600s? Cambridge was a place where theology was being discussed. Theology, philosophy, morality, ethics. These were the kinds of. It was a training ground and a proving ground for people who were so inclined. Meaning, the academy or the university of the 1600s was a religious institution, and I think that in Rav Lichtenstein's mind, Rav Lichtenstein's, let's borrow from him, his Platonic ideal of the academy was that it was a religious institution, right? So where you have, he wrote about Cambridge Platonists, right? In his own mind, there was a Platonic Cambridge, right? This ideal academy, which he thought was actually quite complementary with what goes on in the yeshiva. And I think that this is something that he would put into the category of musar. Now, musar is one of those Hebrew terms that's very difficult to translate. The Musar movement was a movement, a turn toward the ethical, a turn toward looking at Jewish practice and Jewish life as an opportunity for ethical and moral excellence, beyond the strict requirements of halacha. For Rav Lichtenstein, Musar, the best way to develop an ethical personality, the primary way to develop an ethical personality was to expose oneself to a wide breadth of human experience. Now, one of the things that you would say, as opposed to, let's say, we'll call it regular Torah, the Torah has a certain number of fixed texts of the Talmud, of the Mishnah, 63 tractates, however many, paragraphs in Shulchan Aruch, right, in the codes of Jewish law. It's very, right, it's a corpus to be mastered, right? And every last part of it is part of that corpus. Now, when it comes to ethical literature, there's not necessarily a corpus. There are classics, right? There, Mesilat Yesharim, for example, an 18th century work of ethics would be a classic, or Ha'emunot, Chovot HaLevavot, the duties of the heart, originally written in Arabic in the 1100s. That's a classic of Jewish ethical literature. But I think that even the most ardent advocate of Musar study would say the text itself doesn't really matter, meaning whatever gets you to develop that ethical personality, the text is just a vehicle. The text is something that's worth studying because the text will get you to that certain, to that greater, will help you develop a greater ethical personality, right? And whether it's this text or a different text, that doesn't really matter, right? As opposed to, let's say, Bava Metzia, one of the tractates of the Talmud, right? You haven't completed the Torah until you've also studied Bava Metzia, right? Nobody would say you haven't completed the Torah unless you've also studied, I don't know, Chovat HaTalmidim, right? A 20th century ethical treatise by Rav Clonimus Talmish Shapira, who perished in the Holocaust. It was at a yeshiva in Warsaw. Nobody would say that. And when you get to Rav Lichtenstein, when you talk about the flavor, the ethical flavors, the texts that he used to develop his ethical personality and to develop other people's ethical personality, you're introduced to a very interesting cast of characters that you wouldn't necessarily encounter in other works of Musar. For example, C.S. Lewis, John Henry Newman, of course, John Milton, F.H. Bradley, and numerous others. Now, Rav Lichtenstein himself said he doesn't think that English literature has any sort of monopoly on how to develop an ethical human personality. It just happens to be, he would say, that's what he was exposed to, that's what he was introduced to, and that's what he found there. That's what he understood there, right? So he used those texts as a vehicle to develop his own personality, to develop his own morality. And I don't think, I know that he wouldn't say that you have to study John Henry Newman or you have to read, I don't know, C.S. Lewis's Screwtape Letters. He wouldn't say that, but you have to find another text to do it, because you have to expose yourself to a wide variety of real human experience in order to really and truly become an ethical person. You have to understand people where they are. And I would add that his way of learning Talmud, his way of learning Gemara, also facilitated that. The way that he studied, the methods that he used to study, it was whenever he encountered a concept, he would sort of a priori, he would do an initial sketch of what are the different ways of understanding a particular concept, and then he would flesh it out as he would go through the text and as he would go through the commentaries on the text. But part of what he was training his students to do is to look at every single issue, to look at every single concept in a complex way, to look at it through multiple viewpoints, to maintain multiple viewpoints at the same time. He thought that was a very important, he saw that as a very important factor in the development of ethical personalities. of an ethical personality, of a Musar personality, and he also saw it as the correct way to study Talmud, the best way to study Talmud. We've already touched on Rav Lichtenstein as a bridging figure between the religious Zionist and Haredi worlds, right? As his ideology of Hezder was something in between the two, not quite lechatchila, not quite b'diavad. In other ways, he was other ways that he espoused that, meaning his entire being. He cast his lot in terms of where he lived, in terms of where he sent his children to schools with the religious Zionist community. But in other respects, he remained very much apart from the religious Zionist community and much more akin to the Haredi community. One is that he has a critique of centrist orthodoxy, in which he praises the Haredi community for its single-minded devotion for Talmud to Torah study, and he talks about how he wishes he would be able to inculcate that in his own community, in the centrist Orthodox or in the religious Zionist community, and that's something that he saw as a great power of the Haredi community. As far as Zionism goes, Rav Lichtenstein was a non-messianic Zionist in the sense that he would not say that he was averse to saying that the state of Israel, the founding of the state of Israel, was necessarily part of some sort of messianic redemptive process. So I'm sure he certainly hoped it would be, and I'm sure he was certainly well aware of the opportunities created by the state of Israel and the new halachic challenges that were created when you have a state that when halacha has to be thought about at the state level and not just on the individual or communal level, which was the case for 1,500, 1,800 years until the founding of the modern state of Israel. And another thing that he had was, and we talked about it a little bit earlier, he had tremendous faith in what we would call the Gedolim, right? The great Talmudic sages of previous generations. And there are occasions in which he says, I don't know, he's convinced, let's say, intellectually that a certain path, a certain way of being is the correct path, but he says, I will not go in that path, or I feel justified in going in this other path because this is the path that the Gedolim took, the great sages of the previous generations took, right? That was his comfort zone, and that's something that's much more a part of the Haredi world than the religious Zionist world. In conclusion, I want to re-emphasize, I don't think, even though he did bridge between different worlds, right, and he was part of many different worlds, this is not to suggest that he was some sort of disparate personality, that he was a bifurcated personality. I've never met a person in my entire life who was more, let's say, miksha achat. Everything was, his personality was whole and holistic. In fact, a volume came out after his passing on a volume of eulogies and memorial essays. I have a contribution in here as well. It's called A Life Steady and Whole, which is a quote from a poem by Matthew Arnold, another one of his Balei HaMusar, one of his Musarists, right? In a sonnet that where he talks about seeing life steadily and seeing it whole. I never met a person who saw life steadily and whole more than Rav Lichtenstein did, who more embodied the idea, the notion of the pasuk of B'chol derachecha da'ehu, know God in all of your ways, knowing God through everything that he encountered. He denied sort of this question of morality versus halacha, which is something that it exercised, and he wrote about it in a number of occasions, and he denied. He's like, there's a minimum halacha, there's a maximum halacha means so much more, but this idea that there's some sort of opposition between morality and halacha, he denied that. And when you embrace so many ideals, when you embrace so many ideas, it means that you're living a life of constant tension. When you embrace extremes, when you're able to embrace extremes, when you're able to see multiple viewpoints, when you're able to belong to different communities or see the good in different communities, it means you're living a life of tension, which is something that he did. But it's also why he could bridge. And it's also why he could be, there are bridges that are long and there are bridges that are wide. When I think of Rav Lichtenstein, I think of Rav Lichtenstein more as a wide bridge that facilitated more crossing between the two sides of the bridge, not necessarily as a long bridge in terms of connecting two things that were really very far apart. The things that he was connecting were not necessarily far apart, but they were differentiated enough that there was no going back and forth across them. And that's the kind of bridge that I think he was. And I think he was able to do that because he himself was on both sides of the bridge. And everything that I've said can only be a little bit, a tip of the iceberg, a short summary. I continue to study Rav Lichtenstein's works. I continue to read his essays, and he's constantly surprising, which is, I think, probably one of the greatest things that I could say about anyone. That I've read thousands of pages of his writings, and he still continues to surprise. He still continues to find ways to come up with something that I thought I knew how he thinks. I thought I knew the direction that he would take this, but he took it in a different direction, which is just an amazing thing. Okay, that leaves us about 12 minutes for
No. We're going to start. Gilla Rosen is going to start now. 1:15.
Okay.
I'm sorry if that was.
I'm really sorry.
We put the program together very quickly. I'm sorry if there's any confusion, but maybe
I'm really sorry. I apologize to Gilla. I thought it was 45 minutes plus, and then another 15.
It was 45 minutes including. Yeah, I mean, you can go an extra 2-3 minutes. You have any questions, and Gilla can go a couple minutes longer. But we do want to get started. I'm sorry because we have a share at 2:15 too. So what can I say?
My apologies. I'm really sorry to everybody, and especially to Gilla. And I'm out. I'm going to mute myself.
No, okay, it's okay. Okay, thank you.
Don't worry.
By the way, I came a little late, as you know, but of course there is the bridge between the religious community and the non-religious community that Rav Lichtenstein also had, his sort of openness to non-orthodoxy and in a sense of seeing value in non-orthodoxy. That's Adam Ferziger wrote a very important article on fragmentary Judaism. Has many quotes of Rav Lichtenstein saying there's value, we can learn much, we have our disagreements, but there's much we can gain from the Reform and non-Orthodox groups. But I'm for sure not going to take any time. Okay. Thank you, Rabbi Fischer, and I apologize if I cut you short. And Gilla, you want to put your camera so we can see your face a little bit better? Bakasha. There you go. Okay, so I'll briefly introduce Gilla Rosen, Rabbanit Gilla Rosen, who's a Yahrzeit Halacha, is taught at I think he's the Dean Emeritus now at Yakar, taught at Yakar, Lindenbaum, Matan. And of course, the reason she's here today is she was a student of Rav Lichtenstein, attended his Gemara Shir that I attended a number of years earlier as part of the Smicha program at Yeshiva University at Rus Kollel. And that in itself tells you a lot about Rav Lichtenstein, that he allowed, of course, a co-ed Gemara Shir for the Smicha boys at YU to allow women to attend. So, Vakasha Gilla, you can go 5 minutes late if need be.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, first of all, I want to thank Rabbi Kelman for this opportunity to honor Rav Lichtenstein and speak in his memory. And I really do so with great trepidation. I listened to the last bit. I couldn't get on before that because of Yom HaZikaron, but I listened to the last few minutes and 10 minutes or so, and I was glad to see that basically I think that you've heard the basics of the who and the what of Rav Lichtenstein, and I think I might speak a little bit more personally about the experiences of my experiences of Rav Lichtenstein. So this particular moment is a little bit complex. Yom HaZikaron has just started here in Israel, but on the other hand, complexity, the awareness of and the willingness to accept and work with complexity is one of the cornerstones of Lichtenstein's legacy, whether it be religious complexity, whether it be political, whether it be psychological complexity, and therefore it's okay to speak about Rav Lichtenstein at the beginning of Yom HaZikaron. And of course, furthermore, he played an important part in the development of the religious nature of this country. And therefore, it's actually very timely to speak about him just at this nexus of the beginning of Yom HaZikaron. I'll try to relate to anything, leave a few minutes at the end in case people want to raise anything. Or for me, it's okay if you put up your hand, if I can see you and you put up your hand, I'm also happy to relate to something right away. The most striking aspect of Rav Lichtenstein was his Avodat Hashem. Avodat Hashem, literally the word avodah can mean either service or work, and it's usually translated as the service of God. And it was just the reality of his Avodat Hashem. And as one of my sons was talking with this together with my sons, two of whom learned with Rav Lichtenstein, and they were talking about how demanding he was of himself. The intensity, the wholeness of Avodat Hashem. We all try to do it a little, but to be totally an Oved Hashem. And that's what they put on his tombstone, to try to be totally an Oved Hashem. And one of them pointed out, Oved Hashem, not just in the sense of I'm in the service of God, but in the sense of the word la'avod, to work hard. He was intensely working hard and passionately. You could see that his intensity when he taught, when he learned, when he davened, when he listened to you, if you came to talk to him about something. There was an intensity and a passion about it, and a sense that he was working on himself. I remember going to Slichas in the middle of the night, and to hear him, he would just, from the depths of his being, he would say Slichas. It was very good because he liked to stand in the back. But of course, if he's standing in the back, he's right in front of me. So, because the women's section in that shul was in the back. So a man standing in the back, he's not really in the back. He's just right in the edge. And we could really experience, we've davened very, very close up to where he was davening. Now, my first experience of Rav Lichtenstein was actually via my older brother, who was learning in his shir, and I was in teens and my early teens, and there was a demonstration at the United Nations. There was a demonstration thank you, Elli. There was a demonstration at the United Nations about Biafra, about the war and the carnage that was going on in Biafra and the pressure that must be put to stop it. And well, I went with some friends, but my brother had to go to shir. He was in YU, and he went off to shir, except that Rav Lichtenstein made davening and shir at the break of dawn, basically, and then took all the boys from his shir to the subway from Washington Heights, and down they went to the United Nations, where they walked around. It was bitter cold, and the other university groups who were supposed to come didn't come, and basically it was the only university group, from what I understood, that made it there was actually Rav Lichtenstein's shir, all the boys in Rav Lichtenstein's shir. And that was typical. It was imperative to go to that demonstration, but it was also imperative to learn Gemara as usual. And therefore, you just had to do both. And that was a shock to my system in my teens, that sense of both of these are real imperatives and they're both going to happen. And also, too bad on the boys if they have to wake up at the crack of dawn. My brother said he never heard Rav Lichtenstein raise his voice. It's very interesting at Yeshiva University. My son was telling me that there's this story, and this was actually not the one who was there, but it was discussing it. They were discussing on Shabbat Rav Lichtenstein that they heard him really shout once. He broke in the middle of Seder Boker, which was something you couldn't do. I mean, you never stopped learning for anything. You never broke the time boundaries, and you didn't come in late. You weren't supposed to stop early. And he one day in the middle of Seder Boker came in, banged on the bima in the front there, and told the boys he had to speak to them, and told them he had received a letter from a young woman who was pregnant who took the bus from the yeshiva, I guess into Yerushalayim or somewhere else, and there was a bunch of boys on the bus, and none of them got up for her, and she stood there very pregnant, and that was terrible, and she had this horrible ride, and none of the boys got up, and he said, what can I say to her? How can I be so shamed that none of you got up for her, that nobody got up for her? What is happening in this yeshiva, or isn't happening, that happened? So there was this passion about him in all different directions. So that was my first experience in America via my brother. And a few years later, I married, I moved to England. And then in 1991, I came on Aliyah. And a part of the excitement of Aliyah, for sure, was having the opportunity to learn with Rav Lichtenstein. How could I learn with Rav Lichtenstein? Because Rav Lichtenstein, as Rabbi Kelman was saying, was giving a shiur in this satellite of Yeshiva University in Jerusalem, where the young men studying for smicha come for a year to study. And he was giving a shiur once a week to the young men on one evening a week. And he opened it up to whoever wanted to come and learn in Jerusalem or who lived anywhere. It doesn't matter. If you want to come and learn, come. And sure enough, various people came to learn there. But he didn't open up only to men, whoever. Anyway, and who's hungry, come and eat. And so somebody very kindly, a young woman, Dvori Ross, contacted me and said to me, you can come and learn with Rav Lichtenstein. How she knew that I wanted, I don't know. This was amazing. This was a dream. It was such a dream, I'd never even dreamt it. Because that's who my brother really loved learning with. And that's where the whole atmosphere, my father used to learn with the Rav as well, and my brother to a certain extent, but the real enjoyment of learning was coming from Rav Lichtenstein. And suddenly, well, since it was almost impossible for women to find a shiur they could go to, you might just well go to the top. So one of my sons was still in high school, and he was nothing much was happening in the high school he was attending. And so he just, one morning a week, the two of us would learn Chavruta and then go to the shiur. Now, it's very hard to do this because this was what's called a shiur klali, which is all week the boys are learning more connected to the page of the Gemara, what they call the daf. And then once a week in many yeshivot, the Rosh Yeshiva or some other formidable voice comes and gives a shiur, a general shiur, which he can do whatever he wants. He can summarize the issues that have been going on in the pages of that week or page of that week. He can fly off the Gemara. And this was perfection, a perfect space for Rav Lichtenstein, because the whole conceptual approach, and I know you've been hearing about this, of brisk, which is an approach which looks less at the page and more at the issues on the page, was what he could do then. The boys had already studied the basics, and he could go flying off with us into some issue. So it was hard to keep up because you had one morning to do what they were doing all week, but it wasn't impossible, especially because it took the school 2 years to notice that my son didn't turn up every week on the same morning. So we studied, we turned up to this shiur. Now the guests couldn't ask any questions, nothing to do with being women. Yes, the shiur was not for us. It was for the young men to help them learn how to learn in this shita of brisk, in this methodology. And we were there as well. However, there was a big advantage to that because you couldn't ask questions, but he couldn't ask you questions either. So if you hadn't prepared that well, you you were safe. And since he used to often give us a lift home, we could, if we really thought our question was good enough. Yes, and that's the problem, because if you ask a question and it turns out, oh, Rashi asked that question, you're really in bad shape. So if we thought it was good enough, we could ask him on the way home, and he would deal with our questions. So we would go to this shir, and it was really exciting. That was the thing about his shirim. They were exciting. It was hard to understand him. He had a speech defect, and it was really the first 10 minutes every time. You had to get used to his speech again. But he used to review the first 10 minutes anyhow, so it was okay, you had time. And you would really enter as if you were sitting there in the company of Rashi, the Rishonim, Rashi, the Ritva, the Rashba, the Ramban. You were sitting in their company. And Rav Lichtenstein really was thinking, how are they thinking? Thinking with them, except placing it in more of a dialectical approach. And every once in a while, he would even say, Lule Mustafina, if I wasn't afraid, if I wasn't in trepidation, fear, trepidation, I would actually say this. But he would say another approach that would be appropriate to Rashi, the Rambam, the Ritva. He would be among them. So it was as if you were in some sort of time capsule to this period in the 12th, 13th century, and with him, thinking with him. Now, he made use of this dialectical approach of Brisk very much in the way he wanted to use it. So a lot of the Gemara, the parts I enjoyed most, were the Gemaras that talk about where splitting the issues become very, very interesting. So, for instance, when there's a chapter about Hashavat Aveda, about returning lost objects, but it's also a lot about what they call Yeush, which is relinquishing your ownership of that object. And the question is, do you have to consciously relinquish it? After time, do we assume you relinquish it? At what point does it become finders keepers rather than the mitzvah of Hashavat Aveda? And therefore, we're talking about, do we make an objective standard versus a subjective standard? Do we care about what a person is thinking more or what they're saying? Or, for instance, the Gemara that I most enjoyed learning was a chapter in Masechet Shavuot, which is not about the holiday, it's about oaths. And there, he talked, there's a lot of discussion about, does it matter what you said or what you meant? Because language is a problem. It doesn't matter if that's the way language is supposed to mean, that's what it's supposed to mean, or does it matter the way people talk on your street? How are we going to evaluate what you said? And if you say, well, I didn't mean that. If you say it's raining cats and dogs, we know you don't mean a cat is falling out of the sky. But there are places where we don't know. A person says, if I won't do that unless, and then says, I don't know, a camel flies in the air. Did he mean really a camel, or did he mean something else? What does he mean? And these are the places where subjectivity versus objectivity, the mind versus speech versus action, these kind of dialectical views, this dialectical way of thinking was so useful on these kinds of gemarot, types of sugiot, types of issues. And it was just enjoyable. It was just fun. It was like a very tough movie to watch, but you really trying to see how it's going to unfold. The thing is unfolding in front of you or with you. And sometimes when we started to get good at things, we would say, oh, here's the sources he's told us to go all over the Gemara to prepare, not just that page, but a lot of sources. Let's say it's about speech, then there'll be a lot of sources about does speech matter more or intentionality. And then we would say, well, what's he going to do in the shir? Could we try and figure out where is he going to go with what he's given us? And sometimes we succeeded, and sometimes we succeeded less. But it was a way of opening up things, and you could see his background in the world of Torah, as well as what we were talking. I heard Rabbi Fischer talking about, which is the legal world, the philosophical. You could see that he could use those ways of thinking to further push along something that was coming from this Brisk background. And we used to laugh that Brisk has a dialectical position. Is it the chefza or the gava? Is it the person or the object? Is it speech or is it tends to be very dialectical, but he used to tend to divide it then in two again, and then plunge into some middle position. and add that into the argument. So there would be a dialectical kind of thing, and then a splitting within that, and then a plunge into the middle and some kind of position that could draw in both sides. So talk about complexity. That was the way it tended to go, and we used to try to chart it ahead of time. Where might he go? What's he trying to do with these ideas? So besides it being something which is wonderful because you're dealing with the real issues, and you can feel your mind being struggling with it, and you can feel, especially when there were ethical issues, you can feel its effect on you just being trying to work hard. I think part of that Avodat Hashem, the service of God, was, and I know because he would say it, you have to serve God with your mind. You have to work hard on these issues. That's part of serving God, is to sit there and work hard. When I teach now, it's one of the things I really push them to say, it doesn't matter. Sometimes the process is your Avodat Hashem. You're taking your mind and saying, this is what I want to do with my mind this evening. That's what I'm going to do with it. I'm going to try to work on this issue. So that was really the excitement of that shir, notwithstanding that it was sometimes very hard to understand. And he also seemed to have a habit of leaving the last bit not till the next week. And so you had to really recall last week in order to understand the beginning of what he did. Maybe it was on purpose, I don't know. Now, before he got to the shir, this 2-hour Gemara shir, he would do something else. He would spend an hour giving a different shir on something which was more in the world of hashkafa, of Jewish thought, of Musa. So one year it might be on the Ramban, on the Torah. He really loved the Ramban. And usually I didn't make it to that shir, partly because I mistakenly thought that was less somehow important for me than the Gemara, and partly because that was the time I was trying to put the little kids to bed. So it was hard. But one year I did make it, because that was the year that he did it. We were learning Cheskat Habatim, which is the 3rd chapter of Baba Batra, not recommended unless you're really going to work hard. And it was really tough. And he decided that in the shir before Mariv, the hour-long shir, so you're talking about 3 hours altogether that you're sitting in shir, almost straight with just Mariv in between. He was going to do the pieces of Agadata in Baba Batra. And this was the experience of a lifetime for me, because he opened up the year. First of all, let's put some things on the table. There are basically 2 famous approaches from the Middle Ages, clearly explicit in the Middle Ages, about what to do with Agadata. Do we mostly take it literally? Both approaches say we have to see what it's about, what its meaning, what's the musar I'm getting from it. But one of them tends to take Agadata very literally. I'll call that Rashi and Tosfot. They can say, oh, well, what about that one? It doesn't agree with that one. And for instance, the Baalei Tosfot have a problem that there's one midrash that says that Avram served the angels. He was carefully served them first the milk and then the meat. And the other midrash that says, well, the angel said, why are you giving the Torah to the Jewish people? And God said, well, you once went down there and you ate milk and meat together. And Tosfot said, well, they don't agree, those two. And that's one approach, which tends to take Agadot literally. And the other approach is that of the Rambam, and especially his son, who wrote about it. You can read it's among the introductions to the Ein Yaakov, though he obviously didn't write it as an introduction to Ein Yaakov because he lived before that. There, he talks about that you shouldn't take these things literally. Don't take Agadah literally. And if you do take it literally, you're making a fool of yourself, which is your business, but you're also making a fool of Chazal. Fools of Chazal, which is not your business. So the Rav Lichtenstein clearly came down on the side of reading it as a form of literature, Agadata, in which it's mostly figurative. It can be hyperbolic speech, it can be a mashal, an allegory. It's not to be taken literally. That's not the point. In addition, he saw halacha and Agadata as 2 different disciplines. They don't have the same rules. They don't work the same way. It was as if you thought you were going to go into the law faculty and you wandered into the literature faculty, the English literature department, and you expected it to be working on the same lines. They're the same men working, although some of Chazal were more into Agadata or Halacha, but they're not the same rules of how they're thinking and how they're approaching problems and how they're speaking. He felt that very strongly. And therefore, it's a completely different ballgame. Where are you? Are you in the law department? Are you in the philosophy department? Are you in the English department? They're not the same ways of thinking. And that was very important to him. Even the associative forms of Agartha versus the very legal, organized way of thinking in halacha. And therefore, his attitude was, unlike a lot of attitudes today, that when it comes to Agartha, you have tremendous freedom. Tremendous freedom. And you have to assume that's what Chazal wanted. Yes, that's what they meant. When they gave an allegory, they meant it as an allegory. Not it happened like that, and not everyone agrees with him at all in many directions. But that was how he took it. And so the first 2 weeks of this course in Agartha, he decided to talk about fiction. Fiction. Does a religious person need fiction in his life? Does there any point for a religious person to read a work of fiction? What does he get out of it? Now, of course, we knew where he was going to go because we knew what his doctorate was in and what else he had studied. But nevertheless, it was amazing. Now, I have to admit, of the young men who were studying for smicha, the number of them who came to that shir decreased by approximately 50% from 1 week to the next, and again the following week. They didn't know what he wanted from them. What are you coming and talking to me about fiction? I thought I was in shir. They didn't have patience. So, but what he talked about was the way that literature can develop, good literature, helps you to develop your own introspection, your own understanding of yourself, your understanding and empathy for others, and that is really the function in the Avodat Hashem of literature. And so he certainly wanted to. Then he starts talking about Agartha. Once he's talked about fiction, he never says Agartha. He just gives 2 weeks about fiction and then gives a year about Agartha. And he spoke about, we were in Baba Basra, there's a lot of Agartha about Stokka, there's Agartha about Tzaddik Viralo, a good person who suffers, and there's Agartha about Yirat Hashem, and then he went to other places in Shas as well, about the awe of God, the fear of God, the awe of God. But it wasn't only that it was literary analysis, which it was him speaking, using these texts to talk about his own Avodas Hashem. And it was the most personal time I ever experienced of Rabbi Lichtenstein, because he used it to talk about his Yirat Hashem. He might have been talking in the name of Job or of Job's colleagues or whatever, but it was talking about how he understood it. And it was the most personal experience I had in terms of him talking about what he really felt. He used this analysis of these Agarthot to speak about his personal journey in many ways, and it was a phenomenal thing for a Gadol Hador. There you are, and you're sitting there, and a Gadol Hador, one of the greats of the generation, is talking about his personal journey in Avodat Hashem, using the material of the Agartha. Now, do I have enough time? Yes, I do. At a certain point, Rabbi Lichtenstein was instructed by Yeshiva University to chuck out the women. We weren't a lot of us. There were maybe half a dozen at the maximum, usually 2 or 3. But a number of them were the same age as the young men, which actually some of the boys didn't like so much, because if they didn't know the answers. Rabbi Kelman, were there women in the shir when you went?
No, and that's why I was surprised. And I have to thank. It was Lori Novak, of course, who suggested I call you. So I said, "Did you guys?" She said, "No." By the time she came to Israel, they weren't allowing women to shir. I did not know. We did have guests when I was in the shir, but no women. But
right.
I'm very upset to hear that why you did that. I think it's very sad.
Okay, so
that's my personal opinion.
Why you was getting sued because they didn't allow women in to learn in their Yahrzeit program. So why you asked Rabbi Lichtenstein to chuck us out? Why? Because they were saying there, it's not true you can't have women. You do in Israel. Okay? So they asked him to throw us out, and he said, I can't. People are coming to learn. I can't throw them out. How can I throw them out? So he didn't for a year. The next year, Rabbi Lam said to him, I can't win this court case. You have to let them go. So he called me and he said, I want to apologize. I thought, what on earth is Rabbi Lichtenstein calling to apologize to me about? How can Rabbi Lichtenstein call me to apologize? And then he said to me, listen, I'm not the Baal Habayis over there, but I am the Baal Habayis in my yeshiva. Come and learn in the yeshiva. So I did. All right. So I used to go sort of creep past all the boys and go up to the women's section and go to the Shir Kolali there. That's all. But that was amazing that he did that. So I guess Laurie didn't know that she could have crept upstairs to the women's section, and eventually he gave Shir at Migdalos when his daughter opened up Migdalos. He gave Shir then to the women there, and then you had to prepare because he could ask you a question, and he did. So, but by then I was working on that day, and it was very hard for me to. So I very rarely could get there.
By the way, if I can say for a second, just you were mentioning, I can't help it. Of course, I was picked on very often in that shir, and it is quite an experience for Rav Lichtenstein to ask you to read the Gemara. And you better be well prepared because that's all I'll say. 100%.
Yes. So that's why I say for me, this was not a disadvantage to be a woman / guest in this case, especially because we were trying in one morning to learn what the young men had done all week, and I wasn't coming with more experience in Gemara than them. It's very interesting because I said to my brother, I'm going to learn how to learn Gemara, because I'd been learning with Rav Nachum Rabinowitz actually in England, but this was the shita I was going to. He said, well, you will learn how to Gemara, but you'll learn how to think for sure. And that was really very, very true. Rav Lichtenstein lived in Katamon. That's very interesting. You say here that Esther came to Shir Kalali. It was obviously not at the same time because I never saw her, but that's wonderful to hear. But women didn't know, and I guess they couldn't start putting it out there because then there would be maybe too many women would have come, and then it would have been a disturbance maybe. But Rabbi Lichtenstein lived in Katamon, and my husband, Alav Shalom, used to ask him to come speak at Yakar, talk to him about issues that he was trying to deal with. If he had a really difficult halachic slow social issue that he wanted to put in front of him, and they talked together about it. And I did the same in the sense that if there was a really big issue, I would disturb Rav Lichtenstein with it. But it had to be really big because otherwise I wasn't going to disturb him. And the thing about him was that he would try. One case, I asked him a question for the sake of some Talmidim in Pardes who said that I was teaching them tefillah and they felt they couldn't say la mashinim. And he tried so hard to think of a way that they would be able to daven Shemona Esrei without saying la mashinim, which he couldn't think of. And he was working another sefer, and eventually I said, Rav Lichtenstein, just telling them how hard you're trying is already going to be sufficient. The intensity of his trying to find some way forward for these young people who are just beginning to daven and finding some parts of it very difficult. In connection to this, his writing about halacha and ethics, there's an article, Does Jewish Tradition Recognize an Ethic Independent of Halacha, which is superb. I think I relearn that article every few years. Not reread it, relearn it. But it's readable as well as learnable as well. Very worthwhile article to sit and learn, to get a sense of a very big issue, which is their independent sense of ethics. And he believed in an ethical experience that as part of Tselem Elokim, an ethical possibility, an objective possibility of ethics, and that it didn't disappear when we got the Torah. We didn't go downward and not have an ethical being because we got the Torah. And then the question is how those work together, that voice. And here he's going to base himself on the Ramban, but in a sense go further than Ramban, or as one of my sons would say, not the one that to actually cheat a little bit in the sense of, but of course not cheating, but to push the Ramban further than you thought he might have gone. I also worked with Rav Lichtenstein on another occasion in my life. I want to mention, in terms of women and learning, I think this is something where he developed over time. That originally, his earliest article I saw was saying, look, they need to learn what they need to learn if they want to learn, but I don't think I think he could easily imagine the idea. It didn't take him any effort to imagine the idea that somebody just wanted to learn, that somebody felt that that would change them, that learning is the great object. And that therefore it was not hard for him to imagine that women would want to learn, and that therefore, well, if they want to, they should. Though he wasn't pushing it in a more general way at the beginning. When the Yahrzeit program, Yahrzeit Halacha program at Nishmat, he was very encouraging, and the name Yahrzeit Halacha came from him. The idea to think of a name for what the women were doing that would not be Rabbanit, Rabbaniyot, Rabbanit, whatever, but something else came from him, and that was his idea. Now, the other time that I had the opportunity to work with Rabbi Lichtenstein in a completely different kind of way was when in Forum Takana. Forum Takana is an organization that was started to deal with sexual abuse and inappropriate behavior by Rabbanim, religious mentors, teachers, both men and women, who, because of their position of authority, could find that they could get away with things, and the person it was happening to might or might not really be aware. They might be a minor, but they also might be older. It might be a girl in Shevut Leumi who gets a shir with a rabbi once a week, and then, or it could be a teacher at school, or it could be a rabbi of a kehillah. There could be lots of situations. One of the things that's happened as a result of Forum Takana is actually the laws now in Israel have changed, and so many things are actually now legal offenses that were not when we started. But he was among the founders, and his being in Forum Takana was crucial. First of all, many Rabbanim, there were psychologists on this, and machanchim, and Rabbanim, and lawyers, and every time there's a case, it has to include all of those people. But there were many Rabbanim who really didn't understand yet the issues, and thought that sweeping under the carpet, go work somewhere else were forms of solutions. And he was not like that, of course. He really understood it. In fact, he worked on a case together with my husband years before, something that came up years before. It was crucial that he was there, first because he understood it, but also because here you have a gadol, and it was respected. It put Forum Takana on the religious map that he was there. And he was able to explain why the work was necessary. According to halacha, lo ta'amod al dam re'echa, don't stand on your brother's blood. All kinds of reasons that halacha says that the individual, not only the court system, is responsible to make sure that certain things aren't happening. He was both according to halacha in its specifics and because of meta-halachic values. He could also explain how and why it was mutter to use a different approach from the normal halachic approach, which is a beis din, where there only is, you need edim, you need witnesses, and they have to have given hatra'ah, warning, and what type of witnesses and who can be a witness. And here we work with the victim. The victim has to come and report it. Very often there are no witnesses, right? That's the whole point. And we listen to the testimony of a victim. We're not dafka three males. There are a lot of differences here. And he could explain from a halachic perspective what kind of system this is that makes it a permissible and a necessary system and a mitzvah, not just an okay thing to do, but a real mitzvah. So his being on Forum Takana was terribly important. And he had this intensity and passion and tmimut. There's this idea of a tmimut that comes before you learn, and then another tmimut afterwards. And I remember a particular case where he had been one on the group that actually listened to the case and then was reporting about it, and he couldn't get his head around it, because the man who had been the perpetrator claimed, well, it wasn't like you say, and anyway, it was years ago, and now I don't do anything like that, and it was aseres yemei tshuva, and it turned out he was in the middle of abusing a minor. Right, just about as bad as it gets. And he was saying to the Rabbanim sitting there and the psychologists, etc., this was in the past. I haven't done anything like that for a decade or whatever. And Rav Lichtenstein, I remember, couldn't get his head around that the man could do that in aseres yemei tshuva. He couldn't get his head around it. I remember him, it was like a kid saying, it's impossible. But unlike many of his colleagues, he believed it had happened. He couldn't get his head around it. He couldn't understand a man like that, who was a Talmid Chacham, but he knew it had happened, and he acted upon it despite, or maybe even more because, he couldn't understand how a person could behave like that. In other words, the Tmimut meant that something shocked his system completely, but it didn't shock his system to then, all right, I'm going to hide it, I'm going to put it on the mat because it can't be true. It shocked him into, I have to do something about this. It made it even more important to do something about it, the fact that it was so shocking. So I suppose one of the reasons I miss Rabbi Lichtenstein now is when something major comes up, which has an halachic side maybe, or a religious side, a spiritual, I can't go and talk to him and ask him about it. And it's a tremendous loss, because he would answer with tremendous humility, with really take things very seriously, think about and answer them with, obviously I didn't go to bother him about a drop of milk that fell in a chicken soup pot, but talk about big issues, either from my students or from myself. And it's very lonely not to have that possibility when you've had it before. I want to conclude, and then I don't know if anybody has something they want to raise, talk about, say, but I want to conclude first with the fact that I guess because of gender, I get asked, are you a Talmid of Rav Lichtenstein? Yes. You see yourself as a Talmid of Rav Lichtenstein, and I hesitate. But I don't hesitate because of gender. Definitely not. I don't think Rav Lichtenstein would have thought that was silly. And I don't even hesitate because I think, the gap in genius, but between a genius and somebody who's okay is so great. Because I think I have internalized at least some of his ways of thinking. And I know this was mentioned at the end of the last year, the way that you start always, let's go back, what's the real issue? Let's start with the verses in the Torah, if this is a mitzvah that's connected to Torah, then move forward, try to see. There are a lot of ways that I think and I teach and I learn that are totally influenced by him, and then other things I may do as well. So it's not because of that. It's because I don't even know if I aspire sufficiently, never mind be an Oved Hashem, if I even aspire sufficiently to that level of intensity of Avodat Hashem. So if I hesitate when somebody says it, it's because of that side of it. It's neither the, could you be a woman and be his Talmud? Why not? And it's not the intellectual. There might be a big gap, but I think I've got some of the approach. There's a kind of Avodat Hashem there that's, I think, beyond where I am, in not only in kamut, in amount, but in echut, in its nature, in its character, which I hope I would aspire to, but I'm certainly not nowhere near there. And so I don't know about that. Yehi zichro baruch. May his memory be for a blessing to all, and an inspiration for all of us. I don't know if anybody, I've left a couple of minutes in case somebody does want to say something, ask something, by all means, if you want to. Does anybody have anything they want to raise?
Okay. If not, the only thing I'll say is, I gave a shir on Shabbos afternoon on Rav Lichtenstein, on my relationship with him and everything. And I spent sort of, the last few days last week just rereading a lot of his writings. And the book that Rabbi Fischer mentioned, that he's from what's called Steady and Hold, the Eulogies. I just will recommend to people, just read some of Rav Lichtenstein's writing. There's easier readings and harder readings, but Leaves of Faith is many of his classic articles, 2 volumes. By His Light was actually a little bit an easier read because it was written by Reuben Ziegler on his sichot. It wasn't written by Rav Aharon. Rav Aharon writes, you kind of need a dictionary. And there's that. And if you want to read something really, really fascinating, read his interviews with Chaim Sabato, the Rosh
Yes,
Hashiva.
absolutely.
The
Absolutely.
yeah,
They've been
the Rosh,
translated into English, which is
yes,
not a loss because part of the time Rabbi Lichtenstein was thinking in English and translating it into Hebrew. So you might just as well, it's just as good. You can
right.
read them in Hebrew
I
and
have
English.
them
It's much
both in
less.
Hebrew and English
There,
because
yes,
I got it when it was in Hebrew, and then when it was in English, I said, "Oh, great!" It's because I didn't understand every word in the Hebrew,
right.
but it's
It's
a
a
good.
great, that's a great book. I originally didn't buy it because I thought, oh, for heaven's sake, when somebody dies, very often you just can't read the stuff they write about him if you knew the person. It's just annoying. Sometimes with Rav Soloveitchik, I find that people in Israel write all kinds of essays about him. They never heard him, and it's just annoying. But I thought, I don't know, will I? And then people started quoting things from him, and I said, wait a minute, I got to read this, and it is magnificent. It really is.
Yeah,
Mevakshe Panecha. Yes, but what's it
nothing.
called in English?
I
It's called
forget. I have it upstairs in my living room.
Seeking Your Presence, I think.
Right. Yeah, that
Something
might be
like
it.
Seeking Your
For
Presence.
for 20 weeks, Rav Sabata went to interview Rav Lichtenstein. I always like to quote you. I think it's towards the beginning, we were talking about Rabbi Fischer talking about the 17th century Platonist, his PhD at Harvard. So they asked Rav Lichtenstein what he learned at Harvard. He spent 4 years, and he said,
Yeah,
"Life
he
is
said it was
complex.
complex.
Life is
And
complex." That's
people
what
are
he learned at
complex.
Harvard.
And that ability to say, I learned. And but it also helped him when you see him quoting Keats's, you stand when I have fears that I may cease to be and not get these opportunities, and then it all just sinks away, fame and love and fame, and you see that that's a part of who he was, and it's not some sort of artificial kind of labeling. It's who he was. He allowed Musar to come from whoever, or awe and wonder before
Yeah.
HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But the passion of his commitment and his being so demanding of himself, really rubbed off. Sometimes scared people, but also inspired people a lot.
Okay.
So
Yes.
anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Really, thank you very much. And I encourage you can take a 12, 13-minute break. And Rachel Danziger is starting her series. This is why we did it actually at 12:30 as sort of a lead-in. She's doing a 3-part series on her book, Az Nashir, which are new tefillot composed for Yom HaShoah, Yom HaZikaron, Yom HaTzmaut, Yom Yerushalayim, Lag Bomer, I think she put in. So that's going to be right here. You don't have to go anywhere. We'll keep the Zoom on. And so that'll be... I invite everybody to stay, and thank you very much, and thank you, Gilla. And I think what you said at the
Pleasure.
beginning, I think today is his actual Yahrzeit, correct? Is it today or
Yes,
tomorrow?
yes, for
It
you,
is
but it's
today.
not
Just
today anymore for me.
right.
I mean,
I know.
tonight.
Well, here it
But
is.
no, no,
Here's
no. His
today.
today was his actual Yahrzeit,
Right.
or it
That's
is
why
for
I
you his
did. And
Yahrzeit, and it's wonderful to do it today. And it threw me a bit. And then I said, Beseda, he was part of the building. He really is a part of the texture of this country in terms of the religious texture of this country. Not sufficiently at the moment in
right.
our history, but in Yitz Hashem, it will be again more.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. I mean, just Yom
yeah.
HaZikaron, everything is 2 days earlier this year because of Shabbos.
Shabbos, because of Shabbos.
And in that book that I was rereading over Shabbos, steady and whole, he writes one of his frustrations is how sort of little impact he had on his, he's a moderate, and in Israel, moderation is not so popular. And
Also, complexity and sophistication of thought is not as easy as jumping
right,
to one thing or the next,
right,
and it's difficult. But I have hopes that
yeah,
nevertheless, especially when things are in writing, they're out there and people can read them. And there's still a lot of. I was asking my sons, and they were saying, yes, there are a lot of his Talmidim out there.
right.
Or Yerucham, the Yeshivat Yerucham, which was an offshoot of his Talmidim. Completely. That's his Talmidim, and they've taken a very moderate approach at the moment, more moderate than the Gushin even.
Yeah, I mean, Rev
Yeah.
Lichtenstein at this, and Rev Moshe, his son, who follows the same approach, he's a Yachid in the Gush. They like
Yes,
his
that's
Torah,
right.
but they don't like his politics. What can I say? I'm with the Rev Lichtenstein politics. Let's put it that way. His
I'm too,
learning
but
and his
and
politics, which he
yes,
got from
yes,
Rev Soloveitchik. It's the same politics as Rev Soloveitchik. You give up Yerushalayim to save one Jewish life. It's a military question. Well, we'll save one Jewish life, but conceptually,
but
you give up
conceptually,
Yerushalayim to
absolutely.
save one Jewish
Yes,
life.
I heard Rav Salif Tabeshik say it in the Y in New York.
Oh, you heard him. You actually heard him say it.
I actually heard him say it.
So
Yes,
I
he
didn't
did
hear
it
him
at,
say it, but I know he said it.
no, but I actually heard him say it in
Okay.
the Y there. Yes, at the end
Okay.
of one of his Chuvas Rushes. So anyway, you know, take whatever you can from it, and by all means, worth reading some of the material there. It's out
Absolutely.
there, and it's
Absolutely.
really worth
Thank
reading.
you.
And
And
thank you very much for the opportunity, Rabbi
our
Coleman. It
pleasure.
also
Thank you
gave
very
me a
much.
push to reread
Yeah, of
things
course.
he'd
That's
written, and
yeah,
it's
yeah,
really
yeah.
very
And
good to look
I
back
must
on and
say, we
praise it.
put this program together on Sunday. Okay, we decided last minute. I really want to thank my wife's idea, really. She said, "Why aren't you doing anything on Zoom?" As I spoke on Shabbat, she said, "Why don't you do something on Zoom for Rabban?" I said, "That's a great idea." This was on Sunday, so both Rabbi Fischer and Rabbanit Gilla really did this on a whim, on last minute. So I want to thank them more than I thank usually our speakers, who get a little bit more notice than 36 hours, you know. But
Yeah, but
thank
it's such an honor and a responsibility, but a thing to go back into his world and try to share it with people. So
you.
thank you very much for the chat opportunity.
Okay, thank you. Okay,
Bye.
9 minutes. Please God, Rachel Sharansky will be starting. So everybody stay here,
Thank you,
get a cup of
Yishka.
coffee and or tea, whatever you like, or take a walk. It's 24 degrees here, Celsius. Celsius. We're in the south. No, if people think Canada, you know, maybe in that, it's 24 Fahrenheit. Well, it's a beautiful day here today. But anyways, we should hear good news for especially Yom
Amen.
HaSikkot, Yom HaTzah. We should hear
Amen.
Besorah Tova.
Amen.
That's what need more than anything. Okay, thank
Yes,
you.
absolutely. Take care. Thanks. Bye.